I mean, what did you do with that body?
I left it there
in the field.
In the field.
Well, it's under kudzu now.
Yeah,
so
I mean you can't even see it. Yeah.
And a lot of people don't know this, but not only did Ford make 280,000 of the 600 and some thousand World War II Jeeps, they had built 8,800 bombers, B-24 bombers. So they were busy at the plants.
If you have a Bronco, you need to be replacing your gaskets. Welcome back to the channel. Obviously, today feels and looks a little bit different. I'm not in the garage. I'm in my buddy Donnie's shop here in Nashville, and we're doing something a little bit different today. We're recording a podcast. So it's not going to feel like the same how-to content that you would normally find on the channel, but it's going to be a couple guys who enjoy talking about Broncos, just talking about Broncos from Generation 1 all the way up to Generation 6. And we'll be we're just going to keep putting these videos out. And as we record a podcast, we'll throw up the video. No fancy editing, nothing crazy, just a couple guys talking about Broncos. So hopefully you enjoy this episode of the BronCast. Well, here we go. Starting off the BronCast, episode 1. So I've, knowing that we were doing this, we kind of thought, hey, let's start this off and just kind of talk about who we are, talk about kind of, who Donnie is, who John is, so that people who may not know us can kind of know a little bit more about us. So Donnie, let's start with you. We're here in your shop. This is your shop here. Beautiful, beautiful place where you got a beautiful Bronco tub behind us. What do you do here?
Yeah, well, we focused on Gen 1 and Gen 6 Broncos. Behind you is a Gen 1 Bronco steel body, a reproduction body, so you can replace your rusted body with it. But so I started out working in automotive television, and one of the things we were doing on the truck show was building a Bronco for Seafoam. And my job was to bring in all of the parts, everything we needed to assemble the truck, research the chassis, the engines, axles, and, the body was the thing that was most involved because we actually assembled the whole thing on the show with a compression type spot welder from Caroliner.
Okay.
So they're called CTR spot welders. And so it's kind of fun. I got involved in all of that. And when we were done, it's like a two-month process. I said, this is what I want to do. I want to build one myself instead of the host getting to build it. And it was kind of torture. I decided, I want to build one, and then it's like I want to build a bunch of them. There's 100 different ways you can build these, make them super cool. So I left the studios and started building Broncos, and then I got a Gen 6 Bronco recently. And, I can't leave that stock. So, lift kits, everything else you can do to it. And I'm really excited about that too. So we're going to offer, everything you can do to upgrade your Gen 1 Bronco or your Gen 6 Bronco if you can't afford a brand new steel body replacement. But while I was doing all of this, I was on the internet. One of the first things I found were your YouTube videos. Yeah. And that's how I met you. I'm looking at your Bronco that you had, your green one that you still have.
Yep.
And so how did you get involved in all that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was working at a job. I do video production full time, so I film and edit. And at the time, I was working for a company that had, a couple thousand employees. I had a team of about 30 people on the video team. And I just got to a point where I was in meetings all day, every day, marketing meetings, talking about videos, but not doing any videos. The cool thing about the job was I had saved enough money. I bought a Bronco, and but I was like, man, there aren't any YouTube videos on Broncos. At the time, this was like 2015. And so I was like, I will start making YouTube videos about Broncos just to help other people. Like, even if I'm wrong, like, it'll help someone know what not to do. It was kind of my motto. And so I started, just making these videos, and it was this outlet for me at my job where I would come home after sitting in meetings all day and actually get to pick up a camera and get to edit videos again. And so it was like, I got to work with my hands in the garage, but then I also got to get, my video itch scratched. And, so it was a really cool, thing. So yeah, in 2015, started the YouTube channel, on my 1975 Ford Bronco, and started just making videos. And it's just been this labor of love that it's like, I don't make a lot of money off YouTube from it, but it's like the people I've met and the events that I've gone to, I wouldn't trade any of that for the world. And I just love talking about Broncos, which is super fitting for, having a podcast. I've always thought about having a podcast about Broncos, but like always wanted someone to have it with. And so this is a great, little duo. We both live in the same town. We're, close to each other, and we've just gotten to know each other. Now with you, you're Gen 6 and first generation. I also do Gen 6 stuff with Bronco Nation. Another place where people have seen me on YouTube is Bronco Nation, where I've done some how-to videos on the Gen 6. I've taken one of their Gen 6s up, Top of the World Trail and Hell's Revenge.
Mm-hmm.
And so those were super fun. But yeah, so it's been pretty cool. But speaking of internet, where can people find you?
Okay, so the shop is Nashville Early Broncos. And
no, that's mine. That's my shop. That's my YouTube channel.
It is. How do we start that out? Yeah, it's Nashville Bronco Builders, and also Dreamweaver Fabrication.
Yeah.
And
I think your website's Dreamweaver Fabrication, right?
Yeah,
or Dreamweaver
that's
Fab.
the main site.
Yeah. For me, it's NashvilleEarlyBronco.com. YouTube channel, Nashville Early Bronco. Instagram, Nashville Early Bronco, which is a mouthful to say. Shirts, Nashville Bronco, Nashville Bronco. So yeah, we're owning the Nashville Bronco space. So if you're in Nashville, you want to come hang, you just give Donnie and I a little email, a little call.
Go on a club ride. You'll find one of us.
That's right. That's right. Well, so moving on, a part of this podcast, a big thing that we're going to be talking about is this concept of DIY or PAY. And kind of, the thought behind it being, are you going to do it yourself, or are you going to pay someone to do it? And I love our relationship, because it's like, I'm like, oh yeah, like come watch my YouTube video about, whatever it is we're talking about. So I'm going to be more on the DIY side, but you, like being a shop owner, like, oh man, that's tough. You need this tool and you need this tool. Like I would pay someone to do it. So
yeah, we talked about coming up with like a system to measure these jobs, like 5 wrenches, like, one wrench being super easy, you probably have the tools at home.
Yep.
2 wrenches, 3 wrenches, the difficulty goes up, and 5 being the most difficult.
Difficult, yeah. That I shouldn't do, but I probably have a video about it on YouTube. Yeah, so we're thinking, kind of that DIY, PAY, but we also, knowing that a lot of guys are going to be Gen 1 owners or Gen 6 owners going through this, kind of what to look for and inspect, and you got a new Bronco, a Gen 1 Bronco. What are the things that you should be looking for? What are the things that you're looking at with your new Bronco? And so today, what we're going to be talking about are those first day inspections, right?
Yeah, I mean, unless you're buying a brand new Bronco or a Gen 1 that's basically brand new, it's over $200,000. It's probably not going to have any leaks. But if it's 50 years old, we're really looking for what's not leaking. Also, the expectation should be how bad are things leaking, or
and even, gosh, we've noticed that even a $20,000 Bronco could be having all these leaks. It's like there's kind of like this cutoff right now. It's either spend more than 45,000 for a good one, or less than 45,000 and you don't really know what you're getting yourself into. So
yeah, but unless the engine's rebuilt and the transmission's rebuilt and the axles, it's in the brakes, it's probably going to be leaking somewhere.
Yeah,
gas
exactly.
tanks or whatever.
Yep. All right, so talking about first day, you got your new Bronco. Let's go from the back to the front. So what are we looking at in the back? What are some of the leaks that we should be looking for, and fluid that we're looking at in the back?
Probably the most important one to start with is the fuel tank. And if you buy this new Bronco, it's sitting in your garage, you probably smell it if it's leaking gas. You smell it in the kitchen, and then it just permeates the house. So starting at the very back, you've got the gas tank, which is right in front of the rear bumper, and the pump is mounted on top. So you can't really inspect that pump without dropping the tank, but you can follow the lines and check the electrical connection. But starting there, you can follow the fuel lines forward all the way up to the engine, and pretty easily find out whether it's leaking or not.
Yeah, and you're obviously a shop guy, because you just said the pump is mounted in the tank, which would be a new tank, but on the stock 13-gallon tank, the pump would still, if you had a carburetor, the pump would still be on the engine. I think that's a great point. Like on a 23-gallon bigger tank, the pump is on top, and that's really hard to get to, hard to see. But on the stock tank, you've got your pump, that's mechanical pump on the engine. But you mentioned something that I think is so important, and that's the fuel line. So really what you want to do, you want to look for anything that's wet on that fuel tank. If you have a stock one, looking around the seal on the back side of it, which actually is facing the engine, but, and then going down your frame rail and looking for anything wet. That's right along your frame rail, which is on your fuel lines, and your brake lines are there too. Yep. Speaking of brakes, that would be the next thing.
Probably the rear axle and the brakes. And we've got one in right now that's leaking everywhere. The axle seals are leaking, the brakes are leaking back there, and it's just like you have to kind of discern what that is. But brakes being the second most important thing. First you want a fuel leak. The second thing would be the brakes. You want to make sure it stops. So, and in a braking system, if you were to have a failure on one line, you lose the entire braking system. Yeah. So,
didn't you have that happen to you while you were towing?
Yeah, I was actually done towing. I was at a gas station, and it was a 20-year-old dually, and that's how you find out.
Yeah.
Luckily, I had a pair of vice grips, so I was able to stop it from leaking and limp it home. So but so brakes would be the second thing to look at. And again, you got brake lines, you follow the brake lines.
And anything wet around the tire, that's usually brakes. Sometimes it can be axle leaking as well, but that's usually your brakes. If you see like kind of a star pattern on your wheel, that means while you're pushing on your brakes, fluid is leaking out of probably the master cylinder, and it's running off of your tire, so it looks like a star pattern around your wheel. So brakes are important. We'll talk about brakes more next week, because that's our next inspection point, is the brakes. So moving up, coming into the front of the engine, transfer case, transmission, we're kind of hitting next. Now those are big deal things. Like, if you have leaks there, we're getting into 4 or 5 wrench, PAY type stuff. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. So, the automatics didn't come out until later,
Point.
But if you get a Bronco that's had the transmission switched out, you're probably going to have it leaking around the bottom of the transmission. So, and that fluid's usually red. It's pretty obvious, but you can just follow the leak straight down, look up, and you'll see probably which part it was. So, and then so many of them were manual transmissions, 3 on the tree. So the manuals didn't leak as much as autos.
Really?
So, they just don't seem to.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so transmission, look for that, but there's a good chance that it's leaking if you have an automatic. I have an automatic, and it leaks all over the place. Always leaking. And I've had it rebuilt, and it still leaks. So.
Yeah, and you can get them rebuilt from, today, depends on where you go, but anywhere from, get your leaks stopped at maybe $800 all the way up to a rebuild at $3,000-$4,000 and even replacements. And, a lot of people at that price point will give you some sort of warranty on it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Definitely a good thing to do. Good thing to look into if you don't want to ruin your driveway, which I am currently doing because I moved my Bronco out. But all right, so keep on moving up. Brakes up front as well. Brakes and axle up front. Mm-hmm. You definitely want to be checking that. Dana 44, Dana 30. You've got those axles, and so you're looking for leaks on the axle, anything wet that looks wet. You're looking at that on the axle, on the tire, on the brakes, and then moving up to the engine. When you pop that hood, what are you looking for?
Yeah, usually on like the old 302s, they're leaking all over the front of the engine. I mean, you have everything up there. You have the manifold could be, leaking out the front or over the sides, and the heads could be leaking, which goes down the sides around the headers or exhaust. But on the front, usually you have just about everything leaking. So, if you're gonna clean up the leaks on the engine, usually you start at the front, clean it up real good. When you replace the parts, gaskets are really inexpensive. Some of them are as cheap as $6, and but yeah, you want to keep the engine sealed up. So there's no reason why you can't have a Bronco that doesn't have leaks, but then you'll know when it does leak that you're having an issue.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying about gaskets. Like if you have a Bronco, you need to be replacing your gaskets. Like you should learn, valve cover gaskets. Like I would say that's probably one wrench. Like that's a pretty easy thing to do.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But I would say probably not a lot of people have done that to their Bronco because you're so afraid of like, oh, but if I remove this thing, like something else is going to break or what's going to happen, And so, yeah, I think you should do your valve cover gaskets if you haven't yet. That's one wrench. The other thing you mentioned, coolant. You got your radiator up there. You want to check your radiator hoses, your all the belts and all that. I'm like, what is it called? Yeah, all the belts, check for cracks and just old and worn out parts. And something that a lot of people don't know is because your Bronco a lot of them don't have an overflow tank, you actually need to burp your radiator. And I did a video about that on my YouTube channel, but that's an important thing, making sure that you get all the air bubbles out of your system so that you're not introducing any, what'd you call it?
Well, typically, with brakes, people have always heard of bleeding your brakes, but when you let the air out of when you fill up your cooling system, replace a radiator, replace a hose, anything like that, a thermostat, you're going to have a cavitation in a certain spot, which could be around the thermostat, which will keep it from opening and closing. And, you really want that thing to open and close when it reaches certain temperatures. So, you want to burp the coolant system and make sure you get all the air out. But a lot of times you won't know that your cooling system's leaking because until it pressurizes, your engine gets up to operating temperature. Yeah. Until you're driving down the road, it won't start dripping. And of course, you won't see it in your driveway when you get home unless the water pump completely goes out.
Good point. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. You mentioned thermostat. Do you know what thermostat goes on a 302? I was trying to think.
Well, I don't know which one goes on the inline 6 either. You can run them cooler or hotter.
Yeah.
Typically, the manufacturer has already figured out what temperature range they run best at. So
I think I had a 195 temperature or degree thermostat, but I was having cooling issues on my engine, and so I think I went down to a 180, but that was before I really knew about burping your radiator. That was before I knew how the coolant flowed through the engine and stuff like that. And I've done a lot, like my part of the coolant bypassed a section. Like it was whoever had messed with my engine previous had like done some tomfoolery to it, and so it didn't, the coolant didn't flow right. I think they actually had it routed backwards from the water pump or something like that, something crazy. So I just replaced the thermostat, but I think that 180 is still in there. But I don't have cooling problems anymore. But yeah.
Yeah, the heat lever has a cable that runs to a little, essentially a valve on top of the engine. And most people don't realize the reason you don't get heat immediately in an older car, well, pretty much any car, is because the engine has to heat up all that coolant first, and then it gets sent into the firewall and into this heater box under your dash, and you're getting hot air blown off of that hot water and hot coolant. And but the Ford on the old Broncos, the valve's right on top. You can see it with a cable.
Which is another good spot to check for leaks. I've seen, people are like, hey, why am I getting drips coming down my firewall? Well, that's your heater. So your heater hose there, at the connection is dripping, and you're getting drips on the firewall. They
have new electric heaters now where you can just bypass.
Yeah. So
not have the coolant come into the cab.
That is nice. I need to do that. I need to look at that. Well, good. So our DIY or PAY, honestly, just about everything we talked about today, I think you should DIY, other than transmission and transfer case issues, leaks. But everything else, I mean, you should look for your leaks, try to figure out what it is, and try to fix it if you can. What would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And like we talked earlier, a lot of the leaks on these vehicles, they're 1, 2, 3 wrench jobs. They're not like require a master mechanic to do. You wouldn't fix a leak on a transmission, but that's why there are transmission shops. So, exactly. And a lot of the leaks on the engine, you can actually do.
Yep. Well, there you go. John and Donnie's DIY, PAY. This is a DIY kind of day, my kind of day here on the BronCast. But yes, thank you for your wisdom, Donnie. So moving on in our episode today, we've got a little thing that we just wanted to do for the listener, and just kind of open up our podcast to some questions from the audience, a little Q&A time. So if you're thinking while you're watching this, like, hey, I got a question. What I want to ask these guys a question. What do they think about this? Shoot us an email, questions@thebroncast.com. That is questions@THEBRONCAST.com. And we'll get those. We might read it on air and answer it on air. But since this is the first episode, we didn't actually get this question, coming into our email. This is one of the questions I've gotten. And it was from someone who said, hey, John, stupid question, but I figure you'd have a simple answer. I'm looking to buy a classic Bronco, and I'm finding some half cabs that are affordable and pretty cool. How hard is it to turn that into a full cab / wagon / whatever you call it? What do you think,
so it was kind of funny because we were just out in the lot outside the building looking at a half cab to confirm what we were talking about. And that is, that partition wall, also called a bulkhead, it's right behind the back seat, can be removed. It has 8 to 10 bolts across the bottom, maybe 4 going up each side. You have to take the roof off, of course, the half cab off to get to that. I remember Ford, when they first came out with those, one of their first recalls was they had to put more sealant in there to keep it from leaking, but it's not spot welded in, so it can be removed, and you can put a wagon roof on that. Ironically, that's one of the places on a half cab that they rust the most, because water, if it's parked downhill, all that water is going to sit right behind that bulkhead wall and almost rust it right in half.
Yeah. I've heard people talk about that they removed that bulkhead and it was just like their truck was cut in half. It's like, what, we're going to get to this in a little bit, but you mentioned something. What did Ford originally call the half cab?
Oh, yeah, bobtail.
Bobtail.
Yeah, before they came up with a half cab, they called it the bobtail. And it does look like it because the bed's actually shorter than the hood by 10 or 12 inches.
It does. It looks kind of awkward. There's one, the guys at Skyjacker have that half cab that they stretched 14 inches, and it looks great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really, really good job. They did a good job of that. Okay. So there you go. Q&A for this episode. Thank you to whoever sent that one in. Again, if you want to ask us a question, questions at thebroncast.com.
The next thing we want to add is, and do this almost every episode if we can, is a parts counter. And what's your favorite part?
Yeah.
What's my favorite part? And we're always going to have different parts. There's so many parts. We love to buy parts. So
it's every Bronco
we each pick a
owner's
part.
love.
Yeah, that's right. And you have a part?
Yeah. So talking about parts, this one kind of goes along with our question about the half cab, but sitting right behind us, introducing to my YouTube channel, is my Dennis Carpenter Bronco body. So if you don't know, part of what I'm doing on my YouTube channel is I'm building a 74 from the ground up, taking, keeping track of every dollar spent, every hour spent. And in the end, I'm going to try to sell it, turn a profit, and see how that goes. So when I bought my Bronco, I was like, hey, it was literally out in a field and there was kudzu growing through it, and it was just rusted out. So I took the glove box door, and I think I took the doors and the hard top and the hood, and I sold all those. And then I went and bought this from Dennis Carpenter, and it is incredible.
But what did you do with that body?
I left it there
in the field.
In the field.
It's under kudzu now.
Yeah,
so
I mean you can't even see it. Yeah. So I'm super excited to put this in. Donnie and I went and picked it up from Dennis Carpenter, I mean this thing is just beautiful. We put the fenders on it and the grill on it just so that it can, and the hood, so it can kind of sit here. But man, I mean, the quality, the craftsmanship, I'm really looking forward to getting this thing done, and obviously my frame and axles and all that's not under it, but soon, one day it will be. So yeah, so that's my kind of my parts corner. And a lot of people always ask, like, hey, what's the difference? Like, should I just rebuild my body, or should I buy a new one? I am actually on the side of buy a new one, because there's just so much junk that is, if you have rust issues, they are throughout, and the only way to really get them all is get a new tub. But
yeah, and unfortunately they tend to rust at the seams, so that's where the two parts come together. So if you take one part off, it's like, what are you going to weld to? Yeah, so, I'm always a proponent of a new body.
And that's what you build.
I've repaired the rusty ones, and, so my part, actually, believe it or not, would be also Dennis Carpenter, but all of their repair panels, I'll be honest, we order parts from all the other manufacturers and suppliers out there when we build our trucks, and sometimes there's availability issues, but to be honest, we get the Carpenter parts and we don't have to modify them. They fit the rear tubs, and the fuel filler net covers, they match perfectly. Like, we don't have to do any work to those. It saves us hours, and the finished product's so much better. But we do buy and sell the Carpenter tubs also. Anyone can order a tub from them, and we just find that they're the best quality.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it really is. I have gotten a lot of parts from other places, and they haven't been that great. And we got to tour around the Carpenter facility, and it was pretty darn amazing to see what they do and how they do it, and the level of detail that they take in all of their parts. So, definitely. They're not even a sponsor of this podcast, but we both picked it. But I think it's because of how good their parts are that we're talking about it right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, our final piece of this podcast that we will be talking about each week is a little Ford Bronco history. And really, we are wanting to give a little history to people who love the Bronco. You know, if you're listening to this, you probably own a Bronco. You've owned a Bronco at some point, or you want to own a Bronco. So talking about the history of the Bronco is just a fitting thing for this podcast. So we're going to talk about the history of the Ford Bronco.
Yeah, so Ford wasn't really new to producing a small 4x4. You know, a lot of people may not know this, but during World War I, the military needed this utility vehicle, which everyone knows as the Willys Jeep. And they sent out bids to 130 some United States automobile manufacturers. You know, there were 300 at some point before that, but
Wow.
we think there's only 4 now. But, you know, they, I think Willys won the contract is how it worked out.
Okay.
And they found out that was in like July of 41. And by October, they already realized that needing 145 of these vehicles per regiment was just not going to be enough. So the Ford stepped up. And a lot of people don't know this, but not only did Ford make 280,000 of the 600 and some thousand World War II Jeeps that weren't labeled Ford, they looked just like a Jeep. They had built 8,800 bombers, B-24 bombers. So they were busy at the plants, not making cars, because you can't buy like a 42 or 43, 45 Ford. So, but you could, you know, they were busy building bombers and Jeeps.
So Ford had history in quote unquote the Jeep before the Bronco even came out.
Yeah, and what's really funny is the Willys was called a BM model, and the Ford was called a GPW. It was general purpose Willys licensed design. So, and then GP became Jeep. So Ford named the Jeep. I think that's really funny.
That is funny.
Yeah.
And man, that's such a interesting, you know, tidbit of history. And wasn't it that, you may not even know this, but Ford had bolts with the Ford name on it that they would put on the Jeep because they couldn't put their name on the grill or something like that. And
a lot of the flatheads have Ford little ovals in the bolts. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. I was wondering what that was.
What they did was they had made almost 278,000 of the Jeeps that were in the war, and there was a market for those. After the war, people came back and they went back to their ranches, or you know, went to work you know, with the fire department or forestry departments, whatever, construction, and they're like, I really wish I had a Jeep. And so Jeep continued to produce vehicles and
Willys.
And
when
then,
did it become? Do you know when it became?
No, I know the Scout entered the utility market in '61.
Okay,
and the whole market in at the time was about 20,000 vehicles a year, and it grew to about 40,000 vehicles by 1964.
Wow!
And Ford's looking at this market and saying, "Hey, we're going to enter this market. It's growing." So I think at its peak, right before Ford started, it was around 20,000. When Ford got in their first year, they doubled the size of that market with the Bronco.
Wow.
But what's funny is they were, okay, what do we call this thing, you know? And they did all this testing. They had testing in Arizona, and I think one of the main guys at Ford that was responsible for the whole four-wheel drive project, whatever they were going to call it, was Paul Axelrad, and he actually went on one of the testing trips that they had, and he was in a Scout at the time and rolled it. Wow. And got knocked out. I think another guy broke his collarbone, and so they were literally out there testing it. Can you imagine an executive out there, you know, testing the product, making sure it's going to be good? So
that would never happen today.
Yeah.
Which I mean, and all of this is, man, there is just so much history that we're going to be talking about. And I forgot to mention this right at the beginning, but there's a fantastic podcast that we can't not talk about, which is Bring Back Bronco. Man, what a fantastic podcast. And really, that podcast really takes a journalistic approach to how the Bronco started, you know, how it got going and how it got to Generation 6. And so Donnie and I will not do that justice. Like that's not what we're trying to do. So if you haven't yet listened to that podcast, definitely go listen to that.
Yeah. There's 8 episodes and they take you from the very beginning all the way to the release of the brand new Bronco as it comes out and how many times the Bronco got shelved, you know, and almost completely discontinued and then brought back. And it's just a terrific story. I think I've listened to it like at least 3 or 4 times.
Yeah. It's a great, like you're in your car for a couple hours, turn it on, and it's a great podcast. They do great with it.
Another terrific resource is this book, and I think you've actually met Todd Zurcher, haven't you?
Oh yeah.
And he's written a book, The History of the Ford, legendary Ford Bronco, and it is a terrific book too. So
yes, and this book by Todd is definitely like a coffee table piece. It's not just like, oh yeah, like here's some cool history. I mean, he has schematics in there and diagrams in there, and like the attention to detail that Todd put into this book, it really is something that you could be proud of, putting it on your coffee table, you know, in the house. And this is available on Amazon. We'll put a link in the show notes or wherever you're watching this, where you could pick one of these up. I mean, it's expensive, but it's worth it. Like if you just thumb through the pages, you're like, wow, like this is a great book to sit down and flip through. But sorry, I interrupted you. Where were you?
Yeah, that's great. No, I think the book's terrific. You can find your year in there and what the changes were.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. So 2 of our favorite things is that podcast and Todd's book.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there is so much more that we can be talking about with the Ford Bronco, and we are going to get into it. You know, we're going to be talking through all the different years and all the different changes that they made to the Bronco, and it's going to be exciting, but obviously we're not going to put it all into the first podcast. We've gone long enough with this podcast. So, man, thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you for sticking around, and please shoot us an email at questions@thebroncast.com. Tell us what you want to hear. Tell us what you want us to talk about, and any questions that you have. So, Donnie, thank you so much for letting us use your shop.
Oh yeah, this is terrific.
Yeah.
So we had so much more to talk about.
I know.
episodes and episodes, and
well, thank you guys so much, and we'll see you on the next BronCast.